You're good.
So for the next problem set, let's look at what happens if we have an original force of 100 newtons between two objects, and then all of a sudden, one mass doubles, one mass triples. Don't worry about how this happens. And the distance between them tripled. What's going to be our new force? So can we still use our trick with ones? Of course we can. It's going to be real simple if you do it this way. So what happens to G? It never changes. That's 1. My first mass, it was 1, but it doubled, so I need to call it 2. My second mass was 1. It tripled. Let's call it 3. And then on the bottom, what happened to my radius? Well, my radius suddenly tripled. The distance between them grew by a factor of 3. So when I plug those numbers in, we end up with 6 divided by 9, or 2/3. So does that mean, if the original force was 100, does that mean my new force is going to be 2/3? No, but it is going to be 2/3 of the original force. So what is 2/3 of 100? If you multiply 2/3 times 100, you get 66.7 newtons, or 200/3, if you like fractions. Wonderful. Now, for the final trick, sometimes on the EOC, they will ask questions like, what has to happen to keep the force the same? What has to happen to keep the force the same? So in our last example, here's what's going to happen. The radius will suddenly double, and the first mass will suddenly cut in half. What has to happen to M2 in order to keep the force the same? Let's see if we can figure that out. What was the force in our first example? It was just a 1. We like simple numbers. So in our second example, I'm going to plug in a 1 for G. Remember, that never changes, of course. What am I going to plug in for mass 1? Well, we said it cuts in half. I'm going to plug in a half. What about mass 2? I don't know. I'm looking for what mass would keep the force the same. And then on bottom, the radius, for some reason, has doubled, so it's expanded by a factor of 2. So what does this clean up to? What we end up with is 1/2 divided by 4 times M2. So you could just try to figure out 1/2 times what generates a 4, or you can clean this fraction up to 1/8 times M2. 1/2 divided by 4 is the same as 1/8. So what would you want to plug in for M2 in order to make this stay the original force of 1? What number times 1 divided by 8 equals 1? That would be a number of 8. So 8 divided by 8 keeps it 1. Or, for those of you that like, right here, you could just say 1/2 times 8 over 4 is also 1, whichever makes you happy.